First of all, I just want to thank everyone so much for your notes. This talk has changed a lot because of your feedback. And it's actually got a completely different title, which is now in the form of a question. And the question is this: are we losing the Christian story? But before I get to answering that, I actually want to talk to you about a movie that I've really fallen in love with recently. It's called The Flowers of St. Francis. And in The Flowers of St. Francis, you get all these little vignettes about Francis and his merry merry monks, I guess, as they go across the countryside preaching their gospel of love and joy and peace. And actually, it's a lot about preaching, which is fun. It starts off with the monks arguing amongst themselves how best to preach, what you should start with, what you should end with, what should be the goal when you go out and preach. And one of the characters, Brother Genipro, who is highlighted right over here, he really wants to go preach the whole time. He's just like, Francis, let me go out and preach. And Francis is like, you're just not ready yet. You just got to hold on a little bit, Genipro. And finally, near the end of the movie, Francis says, okay, now you can go. I'm going to let you go. But as you go, and right up until the moment that you begin your sermon, I want you to repeat this phrase to yourself over and over again. And the phrase is this: I speak and speak, but accomplish little. I speak and speak, but accomplish little. And I've actually started to say this to myself. I actually just said it a second ago. I've started to say it before sermons that I give, and as a man of many words, I should probably say it on a daily basis. I speak and speak, but accomplish little. And as I look at the way that Christianity is pervaded in our culture, I'm worried that Christians are speaking and speaking, but actually accomplishing very little in terms of being salt and light, in terms of making disciples. We're speaking and we're speaking, but we're accomplishing very little. And so I want to talk about not just speaking, but about the story that we're telling. And I want to talk about the ways that story forms us. I want to talk about, the way that the Christian story should form us, I think. And then I want to end by suggesting one way that we can reclaim this story. But first, I want to tell you a story. There's a picture that sits in my apartment in Pasadena. It's a picture, I don't know if you can make it out, it's of a man and a boy, and they're sitting on the front of a car in the 1940s. And this is actually a picture of my wife's maternal grandfather and her uncle. They're in California, Central Valley. Now, my wife's family is not from California. They're from Oklahoma. And their story bears resemblance to one of the larger myths of our own culture, that of people who fall on hard times and head west for more opportunity. Unfortunately, it wasn't just the economy that sent my wife's grandparents off to California. It was the death of a newborn baby girl. And so they found themselves in the Central Valley, and they left in this hard journey, so much harder than my 3 days on Interstate 40. But they were able to find work in California, so much work, in fact, that they made enough money to go back to Oklahoma a few years later and buy the farm and live there and live a good life after that. Now, to most of us, that's just a nice story. That's just a good story. But to my wife, it is a formative story. That is why this picture sits in our apartment. Because this story and other tales like it about her grandparents shaped the way that she sees the world. So when her husband said, hey, I really want to go to Pasadena, California, because there's this place called Fuller Theological Seminary, though she was afraid to leave behind her home and her family and everything that she knew, there was something within her that told her that the same stuff that was within her grandparents that gave them the strength to pack up everything they had and move west to California also was within her somewhere. That spirit, that gumption, whatever you want to call it, resided within her as well, and that she could face this challenge. See, stories shape us, and I think we know this. It's why a lot of weddings look like the end of some Disney cartoon. It's why every weekend a Fast and Furious movie opens, speeding tickets go up. Especially around the movie theater, I'm going to pull out my Honda Civic, it's going to be awesome, like it's done. It's why I think that this Kickstarter campaign for a real-life hoverboard raised twice as much money as it needed. My only hope is that they get it done in time for Marty to use it. They've only got a few more months left at this point, and I'm really worried that he's not going to be able to get away from the gang if it's not finished in time. But sometimes stories form us in dangerous ways. And sometimes we actually lose the stories that are supposed to form us. And as I look across the Christian world, as I look at the different stories that we're telling in Christian movies and sometimes in sermons, more often in Facebook posts of people who I know to be followers of Jesus, I worry that we're actually losing the Christian story and replacing it with a story that is antithetical to it. Because the story of our culture tells us that the way that you finish the movie, the way that you bring everything to a close, the way that you wrap it all up is you destroy the antagonist. You defeat the person that stands in your way. You do whatever you have to do. In fact, sometimes the entire movie or story is spent gaining the power to do just that. You wipe them off the face of the planet. The world tells us we do whatever we need to do to defeat our enemies. And as we continue to foster an us versus them quality about the Christian story, we're not just messing with the Christian story. I worry that we're losing it altogether because Christ doesn't spend the entire time trying to gain some power to wipe his enemies off the face of the planet. He empties himself of all power. And he becomes obedient to death. Even the Apostle Paul wants to make sure we know the humiliating death of the cross. What concerns me is that if we continue to prefer the narrative of domination and destruction over the narrative of service and love, we're doing nothing less than denying our Lord and Savior. So, how do we tell the Christian story? Do we just make another movie about Jesus? Oh, I hope not. Please, no more. No more. But, how do you tell this story? How do you effectively go about telling the story? And I don't have an easy answer for this, but I want to suggest at least one way. One resource that I think that we've actually ignored that could help us in this, and that's the stories of those who've come before us in the faith. Pope Benedict said, the one who's not the Pope right now, he said that the greatest apologetics the church has are her saints and her art. The greatest apologetics the church has are her saints and her art. And I think the reason is because both help us to see a world that is upside down, where the first are last and the last are first. But I know, especially as Protestants, some of us get a little bit itchy when I start using the word saints, because that word has become synonymous with perfect, or if we're really honest, it's become synonymous with naive. There's this idea that these people are out of touch with reality, that they're aloof. But I think that's actually just a really good trick from getting us to dive deep into these people's stories, because once you do, you realize that they are the most broken, messy, messed up people who maybe, just maybe, are in touch with a deeper sort of reality altogether. I mean, they're the stories of a sex addict who becomes one of the greatest minds of the world, the rich boy who gives up the silver spoon for a life of poverty, the most renowned female warrior ever to walk the face of the planet who wept over her enemies, and the story of a slave who escapes his captors and returns years later not for revenge, but to tell them the story of the gospel, to set them free from the chains that are binding them. And these are just the greatest hits, people. These are just like the biggest ones that everyone knows about. And this is not even including the uncanonized people, including people that you see up here, as well as the missionaries who give up a life of comfort to go and spend their entire lives with people in a place that is foreign to them, or the men and women who fearlessly rode across the American frontier, preaching the good news as they went. Or, more importantly, I think sometimes, the quiet people that you know, that only you know, the brothers and the sisters and the mothers and the fathers and the grandparents who help us to imagine what it would look like to be like Jesus. N.T. Wright said that art, especially Christian art, should be about the place that heaven and earth meet, where they overlap. This is the tabernacle. This is the temple. And for us as Christians, Jesus Christ is the fullest incarnation of this idea. But I want to suggest that the saints are not something different than that. They're actually a more diverse picture of what it looks like to be Jesus in different situations. I don't know about you, but sometimes it's really hard to know what Jesus would do. Sometimes Jesus feels very distant. And sometimes I don't know how, when I'm faced with a difficult decision or circumstance, how to be Christ in that situation. And it is the saints, I want to suggest, that offer us a vision of what that looks like. Because they are the stories of faithful men and women who, across the years, have been Christ in the midst of difficult and dire circumstances. They show us what it means to take up our cross in 1940s Berlin. They show us what it means to take up our cross in the midst of martyrdom and suffering. They show us what it means to take up our cross in the daily, hard tasks of living. They echo across the generations the Apostle Paul's words, "Imitate me as I imitate Christ." And I think that these stories would actually help us be more like Christ. But more than that, I also think people would find them interesting because they are so different than the cultural narrative that we often see on movies and in television. They're so very different. Martin Scorsese, actually, who really loves to destroy his enemies in gory, bloody fashion, once said that he would really like to make a series of films about the saints. Individuals who, he said, by their exemplary action, show us the way to live. And he actually really loved the movie that I referenced at the beginning, The Flowers of St. Francis. And he really loved this scene. And this scene is great because Brother Genipro finally has a crowd to which to preach to. And he's actually surrounded by this army of people, this army that's been terrorizing the countryside, just ravaging everything, destroying everything in their sight. And Brother Genipro gets there, and all the army gathers around him, and you can just see it. He's like, here it is, my time to preach, this is it. And then he realizes that the gospel will be more effectively preached by his actions than by his words. Because Francis told him, I speak, but I accomplish little. And so Genipro just shuts up. And they're going to put him to death. They're going to kill him. And he doesn't even speak out in his defense. And so this warlord comes. He has to see this man who won't speak up for himself. And he comes and he just doesn't understand this stupid, foolish monk. And he's just frustrated by him. He's confused and he's confounded. And he tries to hit him, and Genipro just smiles. And he threatens to kill him, and Genipro just smiles. And so then he does what he has to do. He finally does it. He packs up his army and he leaves. Because he thought that he had the most power in the world, the power of death and life. But in the face of the foolish, smiling monk, he realized that his power was nothing compared to him. And that is the gospel. That is Christ lived out within a different circumstance. The tyrannical warlord is defeated not by the secret super weapon or by the superior battle strategy, but by a foolish, smiling monk. The saints are not the most capable. They aren't always the strongest. They aren't always the smartest. They aren't the people without faults. Rather, they are the people who recognize their faults, who boast in their weakness. And in that thinness, and in that frailty, and in those weaknesses, the light of God shines through in a way that is truly amazing. That is what the saints offer us. A vision of life lived out in frailty and in weakness, so that the power of God may be fully known. Just to prove that I practice what I preach, this past St. Patrick's Day, I actually dressed up as St. Patrick. And we had the Feast of St. Patrick. We have these things in the church calendar called feast days. Most of us don't know what they mean anymore. I don't really know what they mean, but they're there because somebody at some point said, it's really important that we remember these stories. And so at a church I'm helping out at, I dressed up as St. Patrick, and we had Irish songs, and we had some Guinness, and we just had some fun, and then I came out and I shared the story of St. Patrick, which, as I kind of mentioned earlier, is really an amazing story. It's the story of someone who is so in love with the gospel that they go back to the place that they should fear the most. And to do that, Patrick actually has to give up some of his comfort. Actually, all of his comfort. He has to give up his security. He has to give up his safety. And he does it. And the world is better for it. These stories are our stories. These are our family stories. This is our family. And like that picture that sits in my apartment, they help to remind us that the same stuff that gave these men and women the strength to take up their cross also resides in us. That the same gumption, the same strength, the same power that gave them the ability to give it all up and to live a life of weakness and frailty lives in us too. We need to recover this family story. And we need to tell these stories. And we need to talk about them to our children. We need to talk about them to ourselves. We need to put them over our doorposts. We need to talk about them when we're at home and when we're away. We need to remind ourselves that this is where we come from. I speak and I speak, but I accomplish little. Because ultimately, it's not just about the words that we use, but the story that we're telling.